This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with PhD researcher Tom Brown. He discusses his research into underrepresentation in the South Asian community in cricket, how this can be challenged from a talent ID perspective, as well as initiatives to help cricket clubs look for major gains within this area. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy. Perfect. So, Tom, I know we've caught up quite extensively off air there, but I think there's a lot of cheering the fans. So, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How are things your end? All okay?
Yep, all good with me. Excited to get going, and thanks very much for having me on.
Perfect. So, I think a really good starting point here would be just for you to, I guess, discuss who you are, what you do, and I guess a little bit of why you do it as well.
Sure. So my name's Tom Brown. I've just finished a PhD looking into effectively why so few British South Asian players transfer through the talent pathway in cricket. And that's been a 4-year journey working in collaboration with Warwickshire County Cricket Club, Essex County Cricket Club, the ECB, and Birmingham City University. And effectively, that journey took me a long way through lots of different sort of areas of literature, looking from everything from sort of like inclusion and bias literature down to talent ID and sort of best practice around talent ID literature. But my own background, I obviously played cricket till I was about 20 properly, and then after that I played at Warwickshire, and then after that I've sort of played Birmingham Premier League cricket for the last 10 years, and I've coached as well. So I'm the assistant coach for the women's first 11 at Warwickshire as well. So my background was probably more of a practitioner than a researcher, but then through various opportunities and sort of weird things happening in the world, I ended up sort of falling into a great opportunity to do this PhD, like I said, about 4 years ago, and that's just been handed in. I'm happy to say a big weight off my shoulders about last month. So yeah, ready to discuss and move on from there.
Yeah, I can imagine with the amount of work that goes into a PhD, getting that over the line was very pleasing. Knowing a few people, it does take a lot of research and stuff. So I think as a starting point, what is the definition of talent in a sporting context? And I guess, and how do you identify that?
Yeah, do you know what's really interesting? I didn't get put on the paper, but I 2 or 3 of my colleagues at Birmingham wrote a paper trying to define talent, and their sort of overall conclusion was that they couldn't because everyone uses it in a different sort of context. And when you say talent, to me, it's always, if someone's talented, you're almost always talking about the step up from where you are at the moment, or reaching where you're at. So for example, if you were a club cricketer and you're talented, you might be a county cricketer. Whereas if you're a county cricketer and you're really talented, you might be an England cricketer. That kind of measure. So it's a really good paper actually, but it's about defining talent in the system. And like I said, the overall conclusion is it's very difficult to do from a literature base because we've all got such different definitions of where it is and what it stands at. But ultimately, if you were to press for what my definition of it would be around achieving or having the natural ability to actually don't even know what I'm going to say. Yeah, but I'm trying. That paper's really biased me because I remember every definition they gave and how they tore it apart. So I'm trying not to hit each.
No, but I think that's a really good and interesting starting point because everyone's perception is different of what talent is, and I think you mentioned a bias earlier. Sometimes that can be a bias. You talk in a cricketing context. Like I might think that someone who can bowl, 98 miles an hour is a really talented player, whereas your opinion might be, well, no, they've just got good physical gifts that allow them to do that. Their actual accuracy and stuff is very poor. So I think it is a really important contributing factor when we discuss talent identification to acknowledge there is a level of bias from individuals that are looking to do that. So I guess again, going down that ID perspective, are there any key characteristics in terms of what talented individuals, I put that in inverted commas, have, or what they're perceived to have, to allow you to identify them?
Well, that's again one of the real crux of my research was around, and the conclusion to it was the talent system in cricket is far too subjective, and like you said, that bias sort of falls in. We all use terms like talented and something like, oh, he's got something about him or her, this player, and we're really reliant on coaches' opinions to make decisions. And I think one of the big recommendations from my research was we need to start building more objective measures for talent. And there are things out there that correlate with high performance. So there's something called your perceptual cognitive skills, so how well you can identify cues before they happen. So like in cricket, for example, if a bowler's running in, how early in their delivery strike could you as the batter tell what length the ball is going to be bowled, if it's going to be a slower ball, if it's going to be an away swinger, etc. And that highly correlates, the higher scores in those types of tests highly correlate with performance. Yet in cricket, we don't. If you said that to many coaches, I'm not sure they'd understand the concept or have tested it. And I'll be really honest, before I looked into my own research, I wouldn't have known what that is. Yet it's a really good indicator of talent, or sort of predicting future performance, should I say. So I guess that's one of the things that cricket looks for, sort of falls back on. And the other unique thing, or roughly unique thing that cricket has, is bowling and batting are almost completely different sports within one sport. And the measures that you're looking for are really different. So going through my own research, we did a really good piece around sort of early specialization versus early sampling. So players playing one sport compared to players playing multiple sports. And we found that batters could specialize early, whereas bowlers tended to be more later developers and therefore had a bit more of a background from multiple sports. Additionally, basically the two sports are completely different. You're looking for different physiological types as well. So bowlers, especially fast bowlers, tend to be, 6 foot plus, long arms, fast levers, fast switch muscle fibers, etc. Whereas that's what I was going to say, the relative age effect stuff. So batters tend to be born in birth quarters 1 and 2 compared to bowlers both in birth quarters 3 and 4, which is a really interesting thing that came out of the study as well. So in terms of what we're looking for, if I'm being really honest and harsh on a cricket perspective, I think it's far too subjective at the top end at the moment, and we need to be developing more objective measures to get better at that.
I think there's loads to unpick from what you said there, but I think
sorry.
No, it's good. Listen, it's better than going the other way and having very little to say, because that would be a long podcast for everyone to listen to. So I think a good starting point is for us to get a perspective of what your PhD was about. Okay, and then maybe some key observations or key recommendations that you had, or a summary off the back end of it. And then we can obviously work through, like you said, the relative age effect or confirmation bias, all that type of stuff that I'm sure has come into it.
Sure, yeah. So the PhD was looking into, like I said earlier, why British South Asian players aren't transferring through the talent pathways to professional cricket. So if you look just at the raw numbers, I think 30% of players who play cricket in the country are British South Asian, yet less than 5% of professional cricketers are. And it was sort of my job to understand why that was. And when we looked through the talent pathway data, so the representation in talent pathways, there was about 20% at first class counties was British South Asian representation. So clearly, whilst that's obviously a lower number than 30, that's not a significant drop off to that 5%. And the real issues that we need to tackle when we talk about inclusivity and diversity isn't necessarily at participation. It's more at the transfer of talent through the pathway. So what I did was I thought, right, we need to start looking. All elite sport is supposed to be a meritocracy. It can't just be sort of quoted and we need to be hitting X, Y, and Z in terms of representation. It should be based on if you're good enough. So I tried to use what cricket currently uses as measures of good enough and compare and contrast between white and British South Asian players. So initially we looked at performance data. So I know they're not the perfect metrics, but we did a longitudinal study that was sort of retrospective over a 15-year period, looking at players' batting and bowling averages and the wickets and runs scored. And we found no significant differences between the Asian and white players. So immediately you sort of look there and go, well, there's an issue with this issue in representation is not necessarily due to performances on the pitch, and that was from under 10s all the way up to second 11 cricket. So then we brought together a more sort of holistic study and looked at the wider elements that brought into talent selection, and we sort of found that even the ways that we select players, or the metrics that we look for to select players, were different for Asian and white lads. So a big stereotype around South Asian players was that they're not fit enough. And whilst that was certainly true that from a CAGS, that's a county age group perspective, the white lads were fitter than the Asian lads. When it got to the elite performance end and the academy plus sort of players, the Asian lads were actually fitter than the white lads. So again, that's an example of potentially how a stereotype developed over looking at the majority and saying they're not fit, but not actually looking at the guys who are closest to making it and analysing what was going on with them. We also looked at their educational background and their priorities, because again, another stereotype was around British South Asians wanting to go off and become doctors and lawyers and prioritising other careers to cricket. And again, the study we did highlighted no difference between Asian and white lads as to which ones went on to university. So effectively, we sort of all piled that together to look into the talent pathway itself and go, well, what are we doing that's wrong? And that's where I said before, we sort of realised that this whole talent selection process was heavily subjective, and within it, we sort of identified what we called as a cultural ignorance. We obviously, when you're talking about race inclusion, you've got to be very careful around the language you use, and there certainly were instances of racism that we pulled out from the study. But ultimately, we tried. We didn't try. It naturally came across that defining what was happening as racist was different to defining it as an ignorance towards what was going on. And whilst some literature would push those two things together, we sort of drew a line and said, look, the practitioners that are out there aren't purposefully doing these things. They're ignorant to the effects that they have. So, for example, we looked at players' behaviours from a British South Asian background, and you look at things like, so within collectivist culture, where the goals of the group outweigh the goals of the individual, and which is typically seen in Asian and Aborigine cultures, you'll see things like respect is shown differently. They won't make eye contact with adults. They'll look down to show respect. They won't challenge a senior figure of authority, whether that's a coach or just an elder, that they're not going to question back. And then when we look for things we're looking for in the pathway, you look for character being one of these sort of big woo words that is, again, very subjective to assess. But if you're not aware of all these sort of cultural differences, and we can go really in depth about those, that you're not going to be able to assess a player's character and truly understand them. And I think that's where players started to get marginalized. They'd look at a player and go, he's not asking me questions, he's not engaging, he's looking away, he's got a bad attitude, as opposed to actually this is how he shows respect and how he's trying to learn in his own culture. And once you're labelled with those types of things, I'm sure you'll be aware, it's very hard to shake that label, because then it goes into a changing room and someone says, oh, I was working with X, he's this. So it suddenly starts changing other people's minds before they've even met him. And that's where, you know, this sort of turn, that was the biggest thing we looked at for this turn in representation.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating piece. You talk about the behavioural side, like you mentioned there, in terms of at points misunderstanding what respects look like in different cultures. And a big one for me, I find as well, is around, we look for someone who maybe does ask questions or something like that, and they're really outgoing, but they're not always the ones that are actually taken on board or trying to process information. I've recently been on a couple of courses and trying to, I guess, find myself, if you like. And my immediate reaction to when I get asked a question is to think. That's my main thing, is I need to go into try and think about the answer before I then respond. And so at times people mislabel that and go, oh, he's not really listening or not really engaging. But actually, I'm just trying to make sense of what's being asked prior to giving a statement, which, you know, 9, 10, 14, 18-year-old boys, there's going to be some that are the same. there's going to be some that in that paradigm where they just want to go, actually, before I answer this question and look silly in front of the group or give a wrong answer, I just want to take a couple of minutes to think about that. So I think, yeah, just discussing that kind of space of individualized, what does that individual actually, I guess, bring to the table from a performance perspective, but also them as a character. Is there anything that we're missing, or is there anything that we can support them with to either align more to our values, or we more align more to theirs to help them,
Yeah.
and all that type of stuff? I think it's a really fascinating space, and on how that coach to athlete demographic is improving.
So the only thing really that's sort of conclusively been identified to correlate with performance in cricket from a character point of view is resilience. And we don't really have any ways of measuring resilience at the moment. So like I said, it becomes subjective. It becomes, well, what do you think? And if you look at on the pitch stuff, if you play 20 games of cricket a season for your county, you might get one or two opportunities to genuinely show resilience within the game. And if you fail at them, you're not resilient, or it might get missed. And this is what we're trying to say, is that, like, instead of subjectively assessing someone on their behaviours, and like you said there about you're trying to think internally, a lot of these lads are taught not to respond. So all of a sudden, us pushing for answers and questions and judging them on how well they fit into that environment isn't particularly, fair, because they've been taught all their life, when you're being taught to, you look down and you're quiet no matter what you think. And actually, if you speak back and look them in the eye, then you're being disrespectful. But we end up picking those lads because they're going, oh, he's giving me something. He's getting something back. So I think there's loads out there. And one of the big things as well within cricket, we spoke just before we came live, was about the schooling and the private schooling compared to state schooling, which is a huge issue in cricket, which maybe we can touch in a minute. But one of the big things, again, from a character point of view, is lads that go to private schools are obviously, and girls, but they're obviously in smaller class sizes, which correlates with better psychosocial development. You're more interacting with adults more, you're interacting with your peers more because there's fewer of you. Yet go to a state school where there's 40 kids in a class or 30 kids in a class. You've really got two options. You either kind of go introverted, or you go very extroverted and try and get attention. And if I'm honest, you become a bit of a rascal, don't you? You become a bit outspoken. And that's what we're trying to say. These differences have got nothing to do with, if you talked about talent being sort of naturally distributed at birth, that no one's born, where people have talent, there isn't a certain area of the country where there's more talent than others. How do we access those areas? And there's lots of these barriers that kids get sort of forced on them, going to state schools, being brought up in different cultures, that ultimately we need to get better at measuring. And those measurements have to be directly correlated to what affects performance, not kind of what we want to work with and what we enjoy and what we think fits our model of talent.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You mentioned around earlier kind of perceptions or stereotypes that are put on groups.
Yeah.
I know, for example, there was a study in football recently, and I'm going to do disjustice to the person because I can't remember who put it out, but they looked at a Poland versus Ghana game. Very niche, I know. But basically, they did something called 3D rendering, where they removed any identifiable data or individuals, stadium, pitch, and basically had one team all blue, in the entire player looked like a Smurf, if you like, the other team entire red, and then asked people to kind of report on specific players to what they saw particularly from a physical aspect. And it basically highlighted there was no discernible difference when you removed all factors. So obviously there's perception for African players that they're particularly quicker, particularly stronger, etc. But they actually said when you remove it and looked at I guess, raw data, if you like, there wasn't a discernible difference. And then you started focusing more on technical attributes, all of that type of stuff of the blue team or red team, which I think is a really interesting piece in terms of talent ID moving forward. How do you incorporate that from an individual so you're not getting that confirmation bias? But this is a very long-winded question to get back to the thing. But how do you, I guess, stereotypes are being challenged or would be challenged from a cricketing perspective that have kind of been, in inverted commas, known for long periods of times that maybe aren't as true as maybe previously suggested?
Look, like I said before, the two big ones around three big ones around South Asians were not fit enough, and with that sort of becomes an attitude of not having the right attitude, being lazy, and having a poor diet. The second one was going to um, university and wanting to prioritize other careers, and the third one was fielding. We didn't test fielding, if I'm being really honest. So again, that I don't know what the answers are to that. Having just to sort of go on a slight tangent, I run a non-profit that helps called the South Asian Cricket Academy, SACA, and that tries to help British South Asian lads get back into the professional game, which maybe we can touch on a bit later. But I've basically worked with a sort of the country's best South Asian players that aren't contracted at the minute. And whilst there's sort of like in any team variance in it, there's some unbelievable fielders in there. So again, I think it's more a stereotype label to them rather than a rule. But going back to the diet and nutrition stuff, diet is going to be different. And one of the things we're trying to push is when you're a nutritionist or you bring in a nutritionist to work with players, how culturally aware is that nutritionist of the different palates and diets that are out there, and are we prescribing sort of chicken and broccoli to guys that aren't necessarily going to go home and cook chicken and broccoli? Also looking at who makes food in the household. So there was especially within, this is a generalization, but within South Asian culture, a lot of, we see throughout the talent pathway, a lot of the dads coming in to do stuff. Yet at home, it's the mothers making food. So if a dad's coming to a nutrition workshop, how is the message being pushed back to home to cook the right food? And if we do bring in all the mothers and the women who do cook the food, and that is a huge generalization, I don't want to sound too stereotypical, but if we do bring them in on the people who are making the food at home, are they going to listen to to be blunt, a white, young, probably straight male who's a talent nutritionist who's just got a master's? Or do we need to bring in someone who's sort of more familiar with their background? Like we've been looking to bring in like a South Asian chef who might be female to come and talk to them about these are better foods to cook at home and this is how you cook it, and being more culturally aware of what's going on and just making the program more bespoke to the needs of the individual rather than sort of, I think we've got a bit of a maybe shoehorn's a bit stronger term, but we've got a bit of a system where we say we judge players on how well they fit into what we think professional sport should look like, rather than how do we adapt to get the absolute best performance out of our individuals that we're working with.
I think that's a really interesting piece, and what's flagging straight away for me there is why not have someone who's got through the pathway, their mum come in. So like
Yeah.
Adele Rashid, who I'm sure parents have been very supportive to getting through the pathway, is there an opportunity to get his mum to come in and go, actually, we've learnt this as he's gone and played for England and whatnot at those younger age groups. We're trying to support him. These are the type of foods that we could support him with. It's someone that probably resonates. Probably parents will listen because it's the creme de la creme of someone, playing unbelievable international cricket. But straight away, I'm thinking that's a really nice way to have that blended approach of, like you said, individualizing it, but doing it in a way that, speaks to that top level. That's what we're aiming for, and we've got someone that hopefully this will resonate with you.
Yeah, definitely. That's good. I'm going to nick that and suggest it suggest it. But one of the problems with that is so few have made it through the pathway.
Yeah,
you've got Moen and Adil at Yorkshire, and now Moen's at Warwickshire. There's obviously quite a lot going on at Yorkshire at the minute. But you look through that, and I think there's only 20 to 25 British South Asian lads that are currently playing. How many of them, like you say, like of the stature of Adil Rashid, that are in a position to be able to talk to the community about what they did? Fewer and fewer. There's probably 4 or 5 that are around the top end of the pathway. So yes, I think that is a good idea and something we should definitely be looking to do. And we do it a little bit at Warwickshire with Munir Ali, who's Moen's father, and he runs an academy out of Warwickshire. And he's a really good sort of hub or communicator between the pathway and the program, because a lot of people go to him. And not only that, we can kind of check what we are doing with him, and he can almost be not an unofficial consultant, if you like, around what's going on in the Asian community. But even then, you've got to be careful that you're not alienating certain groups by talking to certain groups, and you've got to ensure you're wide encompassing. It's quite a difficult task to make sure you're not just ticking a box and saying, look, we've got X on the board or X on the pathway, and therefore we're inclusive. It's ensuring that you are genuinely engaging and coming up with ideas to, like I say, adapt the pathway to their needs rather than adapt players to our needs.
Maybe Adil Rashid's mum could become a full-time thing and good money out of that as she went round all the counties. So I guess the next question is, how do you challenge those perceptions? So from I guess a scouting perspective, for those individuals that are going to be going down to a cricket green on a Saturday, Tuesday, Sunday afternoon or whatever that is, or to coaches that are going to be working with those players in the pathway, how do you constructively challenge those perceptions to say, actually, let's look at this from an individual basis, or let's look at this on raw data rather than perceptions that historically you thought, or information you've been told secondhand? Because again, it might just be that the previous coach didn't get on with that player and you might actually have a great time with them, which happens quite a lot. So yeah, how do you go constructively challenging that?
Well, like I said, I think we do need to build more objective measures. That cricket is probably still a couple of years off doing, because we've got the foundations for the research around, well, what sort of things correlate, and like I said before, things like resilience and perceptual cognitive skills. But now, right, how do we implement that into a talent pathway? And obviously that will take some time to evaluate and get right. But ultimately, the way I've been doing it, originally when I went around talking to the counties, I would sort of, by complete fluke, everything that kicked off with Yorkshire kicked off. And for those who don't know, there was a former player accused Yorkshire of institutional racism, and a independent inquiry and the DCMS hearing with the government sort of agreed with those accusations. So for the last 2 or 3 years, there's been sort of racism in cricket. It's been a really high profile topic. But that was by complete fluke that they landed whilst I was doing my PhD looking into this. So I kind of went from being in the background doing a bit of research to being flung in front of people to go, no, we're researching, here's our research. Oh, God. But I think the original way I went around talking to people was from that sort of inclusion and the right thing to do sort of thing. We need to help our community, etc. But I don't mean to speak ill of anybody, and nobody disagreed with anything we were saying, but it was almost a sort of, we're listening to you because we have to listen to you sort of thing. We can't not listen to this sort of stuff, especially at this time. What I've found now is that there really isn't a performance advantage to getting this right, and selling that and being able to unlock the different players and different sort of pockets of the community will provide a massive performance advantage. So, for example, at Warwickshire, I think it's 56% of the pathway are now British South Asian. So if you've got more than half of your players coming through the door and you've got a system that doesn't suit them, it's common sense, really. We need to adapt this. We need to change it. And we've not produced many South Asian cricketers in the last 10 years. In the last 4 years, however, we've produced 3 or 4. So we're starting to see that change. So what we're having to do to coaches is simply challenge their understanding of where they're at. And the one thing we're very aware of that might be different to football is cricket doesn't have full-time employees throughout the entire pathway. So when you're talking to people, you've got to be very careful that you're talking about people's sort of second job or their not hobby, but something they're doing out of passion rather than for money. And that's where you've got to be careful not to alienate and going, you guys are old school, you guys are this, blah, blah, blah. They're still really key parts of the talent pathway, and they've got a lot of experience we can draw from. It's ensuring that balance is there, that they're keeping up to date, and they're seeing it as this is the best thing to do, not only from the right moral thing to do, but also from a performance thing to do. And that seems to have resonated a lot more than people sort of seeing, obviously, the BLM movement, the Azim Rafiq stuff at Yorkshire, all this stuff, and some people starting to roll their eyes at this sort of stuff being pushed in society and going, well, yes, there is all that, but also there's this undoubted performance environments if we can learn to lock over half of our pathway, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because everyone talks around the marginal gains, don't they? They say that the 1%, which I think could be wrong, was created by British Cycling in terms of the way they were doing the aerodynamic works and all that.
Yeah.
But you're right in terms of, actually, is this a really underutilized resource or undervalued resource that, if we get right from a performance perspective, can take our group from here up to here. And if we do it before anyone else, those innovators often get monopoly in markets, don't they? Essentially, if you're talking from a technological base rather than just we're talking about people here, but if you manage to get ahead in the market, often you'll stay there because you're able to do it so well. You've got obviously resources in that environment and stuff. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to say, actually, if we do this right from a talent ID perspective, a coaching development perspective, and then pathway perspective, you could end up where we have more talented individuals in our groups. Now, that doesn't matter if it's South Asian, doesn't matter if it's black, doesn't matter if white. Ultimately, we will have more talented individuals in our pathway, which is what you all want.
Exactly.
Coaches want to work with the best players. If that's 100% South Asian, that's 100% South Asian. If that's 100% white, that's 100% white. As long as we put in the pathway prior to that, we're comfortable that, as you said there, we're doing the morally right thing, but also we have weaned out the best players, our pathway from all these different areas. That's what coaches want ultimately.
Yeah, look, 92% of the country go to state school, and 30% of people who play cricket are South Asian. So that, and we typically have a system that heavily favours white, privately educated players. And you go, well, and then like you said, elsewhere we're looking for the 1%ers, and looking for these marginal gains, but we're sort of turning around going, well, hang on, we're missing the vast majority of the population here. Why don't we? You could make huge gains by simply attracting them rather than looking for, spending millions on trying to gain 1% at the very top end, spend millions trying to engage or design better talent pathways.
So to discuss that a little bit further, in terms of the barriers that state to private school has, or some of the barriers that may have, what does that look like from a practical perspective, I guess, in terms of identification or level of support, or what are the actual barriers that puts up?
Well, the absolute obvious one is level of facilities. I mean, you go to some counties and professional sides use private schools as bases to work out because the facilities are so good. So you compare that to, like, I went to a state school and the cricket pitch was part of the playground. And by year 9, I was teaching cricket because I knew more than the teachers. And I don't mean that in a horrible way, but you have guys at a state school who are hired as PE teachers. They've done their PGCE. They're they've almost sort of got that broad understanding. They usually have one sport that they do, which often isn't cricket, but then they've got that broad understanding of all other sports. Cricket also falls into the summer term, which obviously sort of creates a problem for fixturing because of exams. So when you go to a private school, you've then got these unbelievable facilities. They then hire coaches that are usually ex-professionals or level 3, 4 coaches that are cricket specific. They're literally hired to be there to run the cricket. You look at the Department for Education's recommendation around sport in state schools. So they're the ones who decide or recommend what should happen with PE funding. And it's all about, building an active life, getting kids active and a healthy way of living. It's not about elite performance. Whereas kids at the private schools aren't restricted by that. They can do what they want with their budgets. And you do see some private schools not care about sport as much. They might be performing arts or languages or other things. But certainly when you see the big private schools that are sports orientated, you look at the money they pump into it, and there's obvious advantages. But the main thing that the other thing, you don't need a PhD to look at Millfield and compare it to a state school and go which one's better. But the things you can't see behind the scenes, like I touched on it a little bit earlier, where you talked about smaller class sizes correlate with better psychosocial skills, which means you're better at conversing with adults, which means when you come to a talent pathway that subjectively assesses character, you're more likely to be able to converse with those adults, build relationships with coaches, and get a sort of tick in that box for being a good kid or a good character. Additionally, those coaches that work at private schools are well connected. If we get a call from Warwick, at Warwickshire, saying from Michael Powell, who was a former captain of the club, saying we've got a really good young player here, or I get a phone call from Mr. Smith at the state school, just naturally we're human. That will mean different coming from different things. We've just changed the nomination process at Warwickshire. So what we used to do to get a trial is you had to be at a club or a school that would nominate you for a trial, and then we would invite everyone who got nominated in, and we'd watch them, and we'd go through our trial process, and we'd select our teams. But what we really realised with that was, one, we ended up with so many nominations that we had 800 kids come and trial, and it just meant that you had our best coaches looking at kids bowl into the side of the net and, you know, not be able to hold a bat, and you go, this is a waste of time. And you lost the chance to really work with the players that were closest, you know, and you know, you're trying to talk about identifying talent at a young age. I'm sure you spoke to people on the podcast before about how difficult it is to predict future talent, and if you pick a player compared to deselect a player, the effects that has on their development and their image of themselves. And we were making these decisions quite quickly because we only had a small amount of time with them. So what we've done now is we've now entered a video nomination round where anyone from as long as they've got a phone number, can submit their videos through WhatsApp. And we did obviously have to go through a lot of data protection stuff with those videos, but what it meant was we could sit as a coaching group, go through the videos, and in a way, to be kind, sort of wean out the ones we knew weren't going to be of a standard and offer them sort of generic feedback about what we were expecting at this level and what they can do to get better. But then we've got that whole trial period now free to work with the top sort of 20%. And then we can really analyze what, you know, really get to know the players, really understand their background, their training age, do all their maturation data, because maturation and relative age biases, I know they're different, but they're really big in cricket. So it just gives us a lot more time to do that. Sorry, I've completely gone off on one. I forgot what the question was, but ultimately they're the differences between state and private school. Yeah, so there's a plethora, really, if I'm honest.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. As I said, I've actually seen Millfield a number of times. I've played there and also coached there, so I know exactly what you're on about. For anyone that doesn't, go and Google it. It's incredible, the facilities they got there. And I compare that to my school, which, to be fair, was quite a sporty school, but you know, we had one AstroTurf, if you want to call it that, pitch in the middle of two football pitches that got beaten up, and yeah, it was interesting. So yeah, I completely understand that. I really like that idea around the WhatsApp stuff. I'm just thinking now, as you were talking, in terms of from a football perspective, that might be a way to allow nominations to come in, but also try and make it more actionable in terms of who you're going to get opportunities with. I guess the next question for me is around that. What actionable things can clubs, both in cricket but also outside of that? I know we caught up a little bit off air in terms of some of the initiatives we're trying to start at Southampton, but I don't think this is an isolated issue. I think there's probably demographics up and down the country, probably around the world, being honest, that are underrepresented / undervalued / undersupported, and that if people can get into those environments in the right way, they probably untap a lot of major games, not marginal ones. So what actionable things did you and your team kind of come up with around the making sure that, you know, these individuals have opportunities to get into the pathway, to be assessed fairly and appropriately? I think it's important in the pathway, but also hopefully allow them to progress through it so that, you know, as you mentioned earlier, they have enough of an opportunity where the best players get the opportunity, get the advancement, regardless of, you know, backgrounds, particular type of interactions, all that type of stuff.
I think it's really important that any intervention you do is bespoke and specifically targeted to where it needs to be. And I've spoke a lot when talking to, you know, boards and CEOs about being generic with interventions. So the typical one that you always see is sort of lumping interventions with boys and girls together, and especially when you talk about the South Asian community, there's going to be completely different barriers for boys and girls within the pathway. So looking at the boys, we know the problem is not getting them to the pathway, it's getting them through it. Therefore, we've done a huge education piece around the coaches. And like I said, our academy representation through Paul Greetham, who's the academy director, has had a sort of big push on making sure the coaches are doing this and the assessments are objective. And since we've done that, the academy representation's gone from sort of about 15% to 80%. And then the last two lads that we've just signed to the professional team were both British South Asian lads. So that seems to be working at that level. But then there are other counties that need to engage them into the pathway. So in Luton, for example, there's a big sort of street cricket environment down there that don't necessarily play hardball cricket, or if they do play hardball cricket, it's in sort of unofficiated or unofficial leagues that are recreational. So what they've created down there is the Steelbacks Academy. So they're aligned with the county, but they've created a college where they can go and do their either BTEC or A levels at, and they can run a cricket program alongside it. And a coach from Northants goes and coaches on that program. So it's almost like an open sort of talent ID hub for these for Northants, but it's also a chance for the kids to go and continue going to further education, but continue playing cricket and learn other things around cricket, like the media and journalism, all the other stuff that can come with cricket. So that's sort of being bespoke to their needs. Also from the girls' perspective, like I said before, running the Saka program, the first thing that was questioned of me was I came up with this sort of big plan. This is what we're going to do in men's cricket. And the first thing, which was quite rightly labelled me as, what are you going to do for the women? And I went, well, my background is I actually work in the women's game, and my partner is a professional female cricketer. But I didn't know the needs of the South Asian population. I could anecdotally guess at some of them. So what our first thing to do was we've created looking at the very simple data, where is the drop off in representation? It was early, it was under 15. Therefore, we've created a program at under 15s. But the big thing we've done is pledge a lot of funding towards researching, right, what are the specific barriers to the British South Asian female population. And then we can design a bespoke program to help them once we fully understand the issues. And I think that's the big advice I'd give, is that especially in today's society, everyone's sort of rushing, going, right, we need to do something, come up with 6-point plan or something that goes together, and you go, well, what is actually underpinning that? And is it better that we spend a couple of years, I know it's going to be a bit biased from a researcher, but really understanding the problem and really understanding the specific things that we need to eliminate, and then putting in an intervention? Because I think the problem we've got is a lot of organizations put out these plans, they think that'll take the heat off them, they've done something good for the community, and most of the time it is done in goodwill, but then they get the blame thrown back at them in 3 years' time when that 6-point plan didn't work, or it wasn't as effective as desired. So for me, understand the problem, design a bespoke sort of intervention, and then implement.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. Again, something we spoke about previously is understanding the demographics. Southampton's catchment's quite a big one, but you've got a lot of, major cities or towns in that area, all that come with different things. You look at Portsmouth, for example, is in a catchment. It's a dock town. You've got people that are going to be coming in and out of there with, Navy, all of that type of stuff. You compare that to, a South London population, that'll be very, very different, which you then compare that to a Wiltshire that again will be very, very different, So understanding what each of those demographics has in terms of population and personnel and what some of the challenges are, like you said there, is really paramount. London, you can't move for the number of kids that are going to be playing football. Compare that to Wiltshire, which to get from one village or one town to the other probably takes you 25 minutes. I've got no problem saying that because that's where I live. So if anyone gives me a stick about that, that's fine. But like you said there, the understanding of what the actual challenge is more important than actually just trying to fix it. Because if you just try and fix it without actually knowing, then you're probably going to go down a wrong avenue and waste more resources and more time. Whereas if you do the prep work, it allows you to move quicker and more actionable when you then do make that jump into it, if you like.
Yeah, definitely. And the big thing around it is trust, and there's a huge breakdown of trust at the moment, I think, and I think I'm okay in saying this, but between ethnic minorities and the ECB, for example, or cricket in general, maybe not the ECB specifically. And you see almost now every time you see a plan announced or something announced, whether you're on Twitter, and I know Twitter's not the best gauge of society, but whether you're speaking to people, and that immediately there's that, it won't work, this won't happen. And because there's been so many failed attempts before, like I said, so there was a study into racism in 1998, 2011, 2014, and now. So, we've been going on for 20 odd years and not a lot's changed. If anything, if you're being really harsh, the problem's probably got worse in terms of representation at the top level. And that's where we talk about from a trust perspective. And you see things like the ACE program being launched, which is the Afro-Caribbean Engagement Program for Cricket, which is trying to help the Afro-Caribbean community. And I think it's declined by 75% since 2001. And the South Asian community are now less than 5% representation in professional cricket. So you're going, look, this is going the wrong way. And we're going to run out of people to use as role models quite quickly if we're not careful. So role modeling is so important as well for the community that, we've got Moeen Ali, we've got Adil Rashid, we've got Jofra Archer right now, but they're not going to be around forever. We really need to capitalize on that.
No, it makes complete sense. And before I ask this last question, you mentioned a little bit around the Saka initiative and what that looks like. I guess a little bit of promotion for you guys will go a long way for anyone that does listen. So do you just want to explain to people exactly what it is, and if they are or do have any interest, how they, I guess, can get in touch to try and either support the initiative or maybe even be part of it?
Yeah, sure. So we basically run a three-pronged approach to try and help representation in professional cricket, or in elite cricket, should I say, for the British South Asian community. And it's designed as a short to medium term intervention. So our goal is to become obsolete within sort of 3 to 6 years. We don't want to be part of the talent pathway that's relied on forever. It's more a short injection, if you like, of providing the British South Asian community with an additional opportunity. So what we've sort of recognised when I've been talking through all this stuff with you today is there are problems and they're not overnight fixes, and it's going to take time to, redesign or improve talent pathways. And there's lots of players out there that don't have time to wait. And like I just said, we're running out of role models. We're running out of, I think it's 20% of the guys that are left in the British South Asian players are over the age of 34 or 33. So that not to write anyone off, but they might get, they're not going to be around for the next 4 or 5 years. So what we do is we've run an academy, which we're now regionalising. And that academy would sort of compile the best British South Asian players. From a men's point of view, it compiled a mixture of white and British South Asian coaches to work together and help each other with gauging understanding around what's required in the professional environment. And we challenged county second 11s to fixtures. We played 14 of them last year, and we drew 4-1-2 and lost the rest. But we competed in pretty much every game we played in. And like I said, these guys are playing against professional players, and they all have full-time jobs, or they're just not professional cricketers. So it highlights the talents out there that we can compete with guys that are professional cricketers with guys who aren't. And we were really successful. If I do say so myself, we were successful with. We got 3 lads signed this year. So one signed to Worcestershire, one signed to Somerset, and exclusive one's about to be announced. Signed to Glamorgan. As well, and we also got one of our coaches signed to a first-class county as well. So, we've really pushed these lads in terms of their performances. Kashif, who was signed at Worcester, hit the ground running even at Worcester and was straight into the first 11 and was one of their players of the year as well. So, like I said, that men's program is running at the moment. We're aiming for a 3-pronged approach to help players, coaches, and continue the research. So, like I said before, our big thing to highlight around the girls' game was, yes, we're running an under 15 girls academy at the moment, and that academy is being used to help our learning around what's needed as well. So, we're bringing the coaches in, and we're almost, yes, they get free coaching sessions. It's really good ratio with coaches, but our actual aim is to learn from the players about their culture and what they want to do differently. So it's completely free reign. And from that, we'll have 2 PhDs working alongside the programs to try and basically advance and fasten that learning as quick as we can to implement back into the county system. So hopefully, like I said, in 3 to 6 years' time, we're no longer needed in the system sort of organically producing players. So if you are interested in helping, the way to contact us, there's saka-uk.com is the web address. We're also on Twitter, Saka UK. And like I said, give us a follow, give us a shout, and we're more than happy to help players and coaches. The way to apply is there's a phone number which is on the website and on Twitter. And like I said, with the Warwickshire stuff, it's a video application process that we regularly assess and bring guys in and girls in to showcase their skills, and then we go from there.
Perfect. Yeah, really good initiative, which I think hopefully there's some interest from people listening. So last question for me, and normally I go down the player or coach route in terms of who's the best player you coach with or against, or coach with or against. But I'm going to give you two options. It can be either that, so who's the best player or coach you've worked with or against and why, or who is the most inspirational individual in this space that we've discussed today and why. So who's the person that maybe you're seeing make the most strides, or someone for us all to support because you think the work they're doing is so impressive?
Right, from a player point of view, I played with the likes of Moeen Ali, Tom Banton and Ollie Stone, who all played for England. So they're easy to point out as people that I was massively out of my depth playing with, but still was on the field at the same time, so I will claim it. In terms of the most inspirational person, I guess it's actually away from the practitioner side of things. Can I cheat and say two?
That's absolutely fine.
One will be, well, I guess they're both the same. It'll be, one will be Paul Greetham at Warwickshire, who's the academy director there. And he not only was sort of the inspiration behind my research, but I think the hardest thing for researchers is finding a practitioner who's willing to put his money where his mouth is and actually implement what you're learning. And I think that's that's a really invaluable asset. And you can, the proof's in the pudding with what's going on at Warwickshire at the moment. The representation is really heading in a positive direction from an ethnic minority perspective. So I really respect and credit the work he's done that we've tried to support. And then sort of left field of that, the journalist George DeBell, who works at the Cricketer and previously of ESPN Cricket Info, has sort of been massive in persistently pointing out these errors at the top end. And if I'm being really honest, if it hadn't been for him working on the Azim Rafiq case and working on other cases to sort of champion the victims, if you like, of racial discrimination, then I think we'd still be in a position where this wasn't a topic where people wanted to talk about, and it would be behind closed doors. And I think people like that are so important in making sure that it stays at the forefront of people's minds, and we can't get away with a 6-point plan or something like that doesn't work.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that the rationale for why on both of those is great. And yeah, I think for people that may be listening and want to go and do a little bit of digging, go and see the work that these guys do, because you obviously will definitely learn something, but might be something that you can steal. Because I always say the best coaches or best practitioners are the ones that go and steal from other people and implement it in a way that works in their area. But yeah, listen, Tom, really appreciate your time. A great conversation. Hopefully we can catch up again soon.
Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.